I always like to give 5 minutes for people to show up, technical problems and things like that. So we have a treat for you guys today. There's actually a few Arborjet folks on here. My name is Emmett Minnick. I'm the South Central Technical Manager, and talking about Oak Wilt today, and we're kind of tag teaming this one. Joe Aiken is also online. He is the Great Lakes, kind of Upper Midwest Technical Manager. And so let's dive in. A little bit about myself first. I've been with Arborjet for 4 years. Prior to that, I was the plant healthcare manager at a Dallas area tree care company. I was also the stump grinder, the substitute crew leader, the brush dragger, estimator, you name it. I've kind of done it in the tree care world, which is really important to become a good arborist. Got my certified arborist back in 2011, and something cool at the end of last year, I actually became a board certified master arborist, which means I'm a super tree nerd. I went to school at Texas Tech. I have a bachelor's degree in agronomy and a master's degree in crop science, and so I'm really passionate about plant soil science, growing things. My education was geared towards fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. After college, I found that trees were my other passion, and so now with Arborjet, I've kind of married my two working passions together, and I really enjoy what I do. We travel around the country in this position. I used to cover Arizona, and so something that I like to do is go and find a big tree, and this is a national champion tree that was out in Skull Valley, Arizona. So that tree is like 12 feet in diameter, and I always joke that this is the best selfie I've ever taken. So I had my phone up on a fence post and set a timer and ran over to the tree and managed to strike a pose. So I like to find big trees, and every once in a while, if I'm lucky, I can find a big ash tree. Little tree humor there for you folks. Don't laugh too hard. But that's about me, and Joe Aiken is online, so give him a quick minute to introduce himself to you.
Hello, everybody. Joe Aiken, Senior Tech Manager out of just north of Detroit, Michigan. I myself are a certified arborist. I think I'm one of the first guys to do it in Michigan, late 90s. I've been in the tree business over 35 years, and similar to Emmett, I've done everything that you could possibly imagine, from crane work to plant health care. And over the now going on 16 years with Arborjet, I've done a lot of really great things in tree care. Like Emmett, we always seek out champion trees to adopt or take care of. And as Emmett showed you a picture of a real nice ash tree, this is technically the largest white ash tree in North America. That's 87 inches in diameter. So we handle a lot of roles, wear a lot of hats within Arborjet. I feel that we're very lucky to get to do what we get to do for a living. So we're going to let Emmett start rolling first and talking about Oak Wilt down south, and then we're going to kind of slowly migrate to the Midwest and talk about some of the Oak Wilt topics in my neck of the woods also. So back to you, Emmett.
Okay, guys, first start off with a little Oak Wilt history. And before I talk about all this, I want to say that most of this information came from a document that was put together by Dr. Jennifer Juswick and Dr. Dave Apple. Jenny Juswick, she is with University of Minnesota. Dave Apple is with Texas A&M. And in the country, they are probably the two leading experts on Oak Wilt, I would say. And so they have a document that's published called The Origin of Oak Wilt. And so that's where I took a lot of this information. So Oak Wilt has been in the United States for a long time. The first, says initially detected, it's like confirmed diagnosis, was back in 1942 in Wisconsin. However, there was reports of oak mortality for unknown reasons as early as 1890s. the origin of this pathogen is not known. And so in that document, they spent a lot of time talking about some hypotheses and theories of where it came from. And the truth is, they don't know. It's thought to be an introduced species, so an exotic pathogen that somehow got introduced into the United States back in the 1800s. And over the years, it's spread through the native range of oak trees. The first positive ID in Texas was actually occurred in Dallas in 1961. However, there was reports of oak decline throughout Texas as early as 1930s. And so a lot of what happened in the early days of oak wilt was modern science was not there yet. And so they would try to culture diseases and things like that, and they just weren't able to. They didn't understand that Ceratocystis fagacearum, or actually I think they changed the name now, which I'm not going to attempt. I'm just going to continue to call it by the one that I know. Ceratocystis is very sensitive to heat, and so they would collect a branch sample or a core out of a trunk or whatever, and they weren't keeping it cool. And so they would transport it, this was in the early, mid-1900s, they transport it in a hot vehicle or just in the back of the truck or whatever, and that pathogen would actually die because of the heat that it was exposed to. And so if they try to put it into a culturing dish, they weren't able to culture the pathogen. And so that threw them off for a long time until they finally figured out that they needed to keep the samples climate controlled. And so in Texas, if you send a sample to Texas A&M, to the plant diagnostic lab, you got to pack the sample in with dry ice into a cooler and overnight that thing so that it stays viable. And so oak wilt, it kills trees very similarly to Dutch elm disease. They are both vascular wilt diseases. Essentially what happens is this pathogen invades the tree and it begins infecting the xylem tissue, or the water-moving tissues of the tree. And the tree's response to that is to coat it, compartmentalization. So the tree actually walls off its own vascular system in response to being infected. And so what happens is it blocks off its own water-conducting tissues, and so the tree essentially dehydrates. And so the symptoms, which we'll get into a little bit later, the symptoms look a lot like drought, and there's actually a lot of copycat symptoms out there, especially with the red oaks. And so what happened with oak wilt, once they figured out what it was doing, or what they thought it was doing, they borrowed research from Dutch elm disease. And so Dutch elm disease was treated with Macro-Infusion. Arborjet fungicide was developed in the 1970s. That's thiabendazole, and it works great on Dutch elm disease. And so the original treatments for oak wilt were actually thiabendazole. They took the exact same thing they were doing for DED and put it on oak wilt. It didn't work the same. Ceratocystis fagacearum was not impacted by thiabendazole like the Dutch elm disease was. And so they began playing with other chemistries in the triazole family and came across propiconazole. And basically, when they were culturing this in petri dishes, the petri with propiconazole, Ceratocystis could not culture that dish. It's very good. So the thing about this is propiconazole is a fungostat. It stops mycelial growth of that pathogen. And so essentially these treatments, what the goal is to treat the trees and basically starve out that disease. You want the tree to outgrow the disease that's inside the tree. And so once they figured that out, treatment began happening in Texas. The fungicide is Alamo fungicide. It was developed at Texas A&M. And the Oak Wilt suppression project actually initiated before the fungicide treatment. And they were doing a lot of trenching. And so in Texas, it's different than up north. And so that's the reason Joe and I are talking about this disease in tandem today, because what I deal with in Texas is different than what he's dealing with up in Michigan. And so trenching is very important in Texas. The primary spread of oak wilt down here is through root grafting, and we're primarily working on Texas live oaks. Red oaks are also affected, but the live oaks are really what's at risk here. And so managing oak wilt in Texas is significantly different than what they're doing up north. And so the Oak Wilt suppression project started in 1988. Basically, it's a cost share program is the big thing to these large ranchers, where I think the state is like covering half the cost of the trench to trench around these oak wilt disease centers to try to limit the spread. So there's a picture of a rock saw there. That's the primary way that they do trenching down here. So what is oak wilt? I already mentioned it a couple of times, Ceratocystis fagacearum. That's the old name. They changed it to something else. Most people are still going to be calling it the old Ceratocystis name. It affects red oaks primarily. So down in Texas, we have our native shoemart oaks. There's some pin oaks, and then our Texas live oaks. White oaks like bur oak and chinkapin are resistant to this disease. Post oak is another common native white oak in Texas. They are resistant. They can get it. I've seen a post oak with oak wilt. However, it was living in the middle of a live oak grove that had all died from oak wilt. And so the disease pressure must be really high in order for a white oak species to contract oak wilt. Red oaks in Texas typically die within a few weeks of symptom development. If you look at the picture in the center on the bottom, I think I took that photo in April. That's in Dallas. If you look behind that symptomatic tree, you'll see a dead tree. And so that tree died through the disease spread through root grafting. That tree is showing symptoms in April, which is too early for drought, too early for BLS. And so basically I knew that's how I knew it was oak wilt. If you have the presence of a dead tree nearby, that's really what I'm looking for. And so red oaks in Texas die very quickly because of our heat and the demands for water that they have here. Oak wilt exacerbates drought stress, basically. Now, live oaks, they can endure that infection for a few years, and essentially that's because they are better at compartmentalizing than red oaks are. And so in the top right, you can see some nice textbook live oak symptoms. Normally, you can find those on sick live oaks on the leaves, and you see there's actually catechins on that tree, so that picture is taken in the spring. But oftentimes you'll just find leaves with those symptoms on the ground because the trees begin to defoliate. In the bottom left, you see the red oak symptoms, and red oaks are a little bit trickier to diagnose because the symptoms basically mimic that of drought or bacterial leaf scorch or some other abiotic scorch that may have happened. And the scary thing about oak wilt is, it's been around since the 80s, and so there's lots of information out there. And I don't know how many times I got a call from a concerned homeowner, and they say, "Hey, my tree's got oak wilt." So they have an oak, it's sick, they think it's oak wilt. And that's not the case. There's lots of things that kill trees, lots of diseases out there that affect oaks. And so oak wilt is a bad one, but that's not always what's killing a tree. Here's a photo I took. This was down in Austin, Texas, at one of the city parks. And those, again, those are your textbook. Venal necrosis is what those symptoms are called. And this is the stuff that pathologists love. If you can find these nice textbook symptoms, and you can see how the veins in those live oak leaves are just totally dead, and then it's spreading outward. On the left, those are symptomatic oak wilt leaves, and so are the ones in the center. Those are not textbook symptoms. The ones on the left look more like herbicide injury. The ones in the center, it's kind of nondescript. But those trees are definitely infected with oak wilt. I took all three of these photos actually when I was out looking at some oak wilt plots with the Texas Forest Service. You can see the dead trees on the right, all those lesions on the bark, that's from hypoxylin canker. And so those trees died from oak wilt, then the hypoxylin canker set in as the trees were dying and finished them off. And that's actually, that picture on the right, that's actually where that post oak was. I should have gotten a picture of it, but I did not. So I mentioned earlier that the treatments were all borrowed from Dutch elm disease. And so macro-infusion is how people have been treating oak wilt since the 1990s. And the reason Dutch elm disease is treated this way is because thiobendazole is very phytotoxic to trees. It has to be diluted with a lot of water or the fungicide will kill the tree itself. And so that technology was borrowed for oak wilt. However, propiconazole is it doesn't have the same properties as thiobendazole. It's not deadly to trees like that. And so the volume of water was reduced. Most time with Dutch elm disease, they're using like a 55-gallon drum. So with oak wilt, they've reduced it. And I took these photos down in Austin. This is kind of what's going on. It's a slow process to inject these trees with that volume of water, especially if they're infected. I mentioned earlier the disease kills trees by inhibiting the vascular system. And so with any tree injection, no matter how you're doing it, you're depending on that vascular system. And so if the tree's infected and you're trying to inject a beer keg full of fungicide, trying to think back to my college days, how much beer is in those, say 20, 30 gallons, into a tree that doesn't have a fully functioning vascular system, it's very difficult. And so oftentimes applicators that I talk to, they'll chain these. You can see in that right photo, there's a chain around those beer kegs, and that's actually attached to the tree. They slap a fungicide sticker on there, and they leave it out there for a couple of days, and they'll come back and pick it up. And oftentimes they tell me, hey, the tree didn't take it. We tried, you know. And so macro-infusion is still the standard, and it stands to reason that you're going to get better distribution of fungicide with more application sites. And so that's really the thinking on this, is you want to get down low, because in Texas we're dealing with root grafting. So you want to inject that fungicide as low as possible. So it requires some buttress root excavation, which is not always possible. And you can see, you know, if you have in a landscape setting, homeowners aren't always a fan of that. And so here's a large live oak. You can see they've got 3 systems set up on that. They've got that buttress root excavated really well, and they're trying to get as much product into the tree as possible. At Arborjet, we do things a little bit different. The tree IV is an effective alternative, and so essentially we're able to inject the same dosage of fungicide. We just cut the water way down. And so this photo is actually, back up. This house was next to a golf course, And then this tree was on the golf course. And I was demonstrating to the golf course how they could treat their trees in-house. And so we're able to apply the same doses of fungicide. We just cut the water back, and it works just fine. This is a property that I was helping an applicator with. And you can see we have several tree IVs hooked up on multiple trees. Property 2 houses down had trees dying from oak wilt. And so we came out here, and I want to say this homeowner had 15 oak trees on the property, and we were treating all of them. And so the biggest thing with treating and using fungicides to treat oak wilt is that you have to treat the disease center. You can't just, you're not going to do any good if this one person treats, but all the neighbors don't. And so I'm a fan of preventative applications. Time and time again with research, it's been proven that preventative applications work better. If you're doing therapeutic treatments, I said earlier that live oaks hang around for three or so years. Those trees can live, but they oftentimes look very sick. Even though they're alive, they just look poor. And so I'm not a big fan of therapeutic treatments because you're leaving potential disease inoculum in the field. So I'd much prefer to treat the healthy trees and remove the sick trees. Get that disease out of there. I think it was last year we released the F-Series Tree IV, and this has been a huge hit in Texas because we have the 1.5 liter bottles. So we're able to, the guys still want to dilute with water, and so this allows us to increase our volume that we're putting into the trees. And it's been working great. The treatment with propiconazole on a therapeutic sense requires 20 milliliters per inch diameter, and then you're diluting that down with 2 to 3 parts of water. And so it's a higher volume application, and the F-Series Tree IV has allowed us to do that, and it's really been nice for oak wilt treatments. So I've talked a little bit about root grafting. Essentially what happens, you have trees growing in the same area, their roots cross over, and you can see in that bottom photo, the roots actually graft together. And so the trees are connected. And that's how ceratocystis is spreading from tree to tree. There is also an insect vector that's associated with oak wilt. In Texas, I don't think there's as much insect vector moving the disease around. That one vector that they've associated with this disease is the nitidulid beetle. And so essentially what happens is on red oaks that have died from oak wilt, and Joe's going to talk a bit about this, they'll create these fungal mats underneath the bark. The bark will actually pop open, and these nitidulid beetles, who are fungus farmers, will be attracted to that fungus. They'll get the spores, they'll roll around and play in it, and they'll get the spores all over them. And then they can fly to an uninfected tree, onto a fresh pruning cut or other wound, and infect the tree that way. Because only red oaks create this, not live oaks, the spread of that in Texas is not as great. Now up north in Michigan, Wisconsin, they're dealing with red oak species, and so this is much more common. And so what part of that oak wilt suppression project from the Texas Forest Service is the recommendation of not pruning oak trees from February through June, because that's when that nitidulid beetle is most active. However, I think there's a lot of stuff we know about oak wilt, but I think there's even more that we don't know. Now, there's a lot of insects that feed on trees. And to say there's only one insect vector of this, I think there may be more to it than that, because I've been on properties with some Forest Service guys, and they're like, well, man, how did oak wilt get way over there? How'd that happen? I don't know. And so I think there's more to it, but they're doing the best they can. The thing about trees and diseases is they don't read books, and you can't tell them what to do. And so I think every day there's an opportunity to learn something new, and I think we're still learning about oak wilt. Borrow this slide from Texas A&M. So how's it spread? Above ground, long distance, via those sap-feeding beetles, the nitidulid beetles. Fungal spores are picked up from infected red oaks, and you can see how they bolded red oaks because that doesn't happen on live oaks. They're carried to fresh wounds on other oak species, and that's how a new disease center can start. So this can actually happen with firewood. So if somebody removes a red oak for firewood and they transport it across the state, like there's some disease centers out in Lubbock, Texas, and Amarillo, Texas, and Midland, which is not the native range of live oak. And so that got transported by people. That's how you can start this. And you can see in that bottom left photo, that beetle is very tiny. Getting some research on what's been done. There's lots of different ways to inject trees, guys. I said earlier that Macro-Infusion is the standard for oak wilt treatment. If you look up research on it, that's what you're going to be looking at. And so this was a study that was installed in Central Texas and monitored for 3 years. So these trees were injected with these different devices with 14.3% propiconazole. And actually, what happened, there was no significant difference between using our tree IV and the Macro-Infusion method. And so these trees were injected, and then they came back and inoculated the trees, I think like a month after the injections were applied. A couple of years ago, Arborjet, we released Propizol, which is 14.3% propiconazole. This product is, Syngenta is a manufacturing partner of ours. This is actually manufactured by Syngenta. It's the broadest label of any propiconazole product on the market. And so we've got essentially the Alamo label is on here. The Banner Max label is on here. And then through 2EE expansions and our own research that Arborjet does, we've been able to add even more diseases to the label. And so it's got tree injection label for Macro-Infusion, for micro injection. It's got a turf label. It's got a foliar spray label. The broadest label of any propiconazole product you can find. More recent research, this was done in conjunction with Jennifer Juswick up at Minnesota on red oaks. Red oaks are great for researching oak wilt because they either die or they don't, and essentially that's what we found. The trees treated with Propizol, so the tree IV diluted with 1 part water versus treated with Alamo at a Macro-Infusion treatment with 49 parts water. Then they came back and inoculated the trees. The inoculated trees died. The treated trees lived. And that is all that that's my spiel on it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Aiken.
Great job, Emmett. It's interesting the similarities between the fight in Texas and Michigan, and then it's also amazing the differences also. Starting up in the Midwest, obviously it's been in Michigan not much later in the late 40s as it was discovered in Minnesota. So this pathogen has been kind of like a little ember just kind of stewing in the background. I think in Michigan and the Midwest, it's kind of on everybody's radar in becoming a serious threat because it's on the coattails of emerald ash borer wiping out all the ash trees. So now here we are, we lose all the ash trees. Now we're looking at what's next. Now the red oaks are struggling. Emmett briefly touched on this, but in the Midwest, there's a lot of other pathogens that the signs and symptoms of the decline on the red oak tree family are similar to a symptomatic oak wilt tree. One of the biggest ones is two-line chestnut borer up here. It's getting pretty bad, and the tree looks a lot like it. Amarillo root rot, and I talked about drought. Yeah, drought, but in the Midwest, it's very rare that we have drought seasons. Iron deficiency, other borers, anthracnose, and bacterial leaf scorch. There's a lot of things that could be similar in your initial viewing of a tree. So keep that in mind, and the reason I say that is because I've had people treat trees with a fungicide, and it was an insect killing the tree. So you have to be very careful, really put your finger on it to confirm what you're going after. I put this kind of on our timeline in Michigan. As you can see in 2005, not a lot of resources going in up here. They kind of showed some confirmed oak wilt sites. Then you look at 10 years down the road, how it spread. Emmett also made a comment about, well, how did it get here? Because last year, one of the largest new finds of symptomatic trees was on a newly formed state park on Belle Isle in Detroit, Michigan. And at the time of the discovery and the positive ID of oak wilt, it was 2 or 3 counties away. So the first choice is, well, campers. People brought firewood on the island. Well, this park, there is no camping and there are no bonfires. There's no fire pits. So we're confused at how did it get that far if we're not transporting firewood. So we're right. There's a lot that we just don't know about that. So this is showing you the 10 years, how fast it's spreading in Michigan and why it's becoming a serious threat. Next slide, please. Oak wilt. Oak wilt, Michigan. Oak wilt control. Right now, we're really preaching prevention. Prevention is pruning cycles, when to touch and unnecessarily wound an oak tree during the flight of the beetle. A little fact about the Matula beetle, the picnic beetle, which we're calling it here, sap beetles, is that they're multi-generations per year. So even though we say it was February to July, I think, Emmett, in Texas, because we're a little colder up here, we got April to June. But we're all the practicing arborists up here are taking the air of caution because a lot of the information that we're using for oak wilt does cross over to Dutch elm disease. Most of the great arborists or well-to-do customer or tree care companies in Michigan are waiting till after the first or second frost into October and November before they'll start treating or trimming oak trees up here in Michigan and in the Midwest. Just a little bit added insurance. One thing that we are preaching, if you're going to do it, and you're going to do it after make a cut on an oak tree or a storm came by and broke off some branches, is that we are painting the cuts, and we're using a product up here called Tree Guard. It also has a antibiotic into it, just as an added extra measure. The DNR up here in Michigan are doing a great job of identification and mapping. They have a hotline, which I'll give to you later, that if you suspect that it could be oak wilt, you can contact the Michigan DNR. They'll have an agent out. They'll take cultures, and they'll positively identify it. If it is, they'll tag that tree. I think it's important to understand where it's at, because that will be part of your oak wilt plan. How far is it? Is it positive or is it not? That's a huge first stepping stone. Yeah, before you can even get into treatment or management, you got to make sure that that's the pathogen that you're dealing with. Next. Symptomatic red oak leaves. This is what you see in the Midwest. You'll start to see some flagging one branch, maybe two. If you look at the red oak leaves, they're not, it's not interveinal, it's not veinal, it's just random necrosis across the leaf. And then what happens is it'll turn quickly again. Within a couple of weeks, the tree could die. End of July, beginning of August, the tree starts to defoliate. So a lot of people up north, northern Michigan, we call it going up north on the weekend, you'll get up there and your whole lawn will be covered with oak leaves. That would be your first sign that there's something going on. And at that point, it's time to contact an arborist to get a closer look. Next.
Yeah, Joe, so that kind of goes into what I'm talking about. Whenever somebody calls me, like I got a call yesterday about oak wilt, and a guy doesn't have experience with it. And I said, well, the way I would start is by finding a dead tree. If there are dead trees in that neighborhood, now you've got something to build on. That would make more sense. If it's just down here, if it's just a tree that dies up out of nowhere, I would lean more towards, hey, maybe it's got some root rot issues, wood borers, things like that. But if there's other dead trees in the neighborhood, hey, now you may be dealing with the disease.
Yeah, or this could be epicenter. It could be the first one in the area.
Right.
But I think you're right. On a good site inspection, it's very, very important to take a look at adjoining properties. A lot of these cabins up north are adjoining state forests, what aren't being, they're being as managed the best as DNR can, but it could be coming from state property also. So great point, Emmett.
I think that's interesting that they found it on Bell Island out there. And that goes to show that the insect vector relationship with this disease is greater in your neck of the woods.
Exactly. So I think that it may facilitate some more research on the flight patterns of the beetle. How far are they flying, and why are some trees being infested? Acquiring the disease and others aren't. The next step, and we were laughing, Emmett and I were talking about the presentation before we started, is that in the Midwest, we have really large, prominent, obvious, once you know what you're looking for, signs of pressure pads. Where I think, Emmett, you were saying that it's kind of still a mystery that no one's ever found them in Texas.
Yeah, I've worked with the Oak Wilt experts. There's a few guys in the state with the Forest Service and people that used to be with the Forest Service that I work with, and Dave Apple himself. And it's very, very rare to find a pressure pad or a fungal mat in Texas.
Yeah, up here it's so common that once you see the defoliation, if you look at the bole of the tree, and the picture on the left, you can see the crack in the tree because there's so much internal pressure as this fungal pathogen grows. You need to get up in there and pop it open on the tree to the right. And then here's these big fungal mats growing. Another telltale sign, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was working with Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and one of the experts said, well, get up there and smell it. And I honestly thought they were going to play a joke on me. So I got up on the tailgate, got up to the tree, and I got my nose up into that fungal mat. Believe it or not, in the Midwest, those fungal mats smell like juicy fruit chewing gum. There's such a sweet smell that it's pretty amazing. So that's another sign of oak wilt and those pressure pads. So
Joe,
yeah, once.
What's interesting on your photo on the right, those look like bark beetle galleries that are in there.
Yeah,
am I right, or is that just So to say that oak wilt only has one insect vector, the Nitidula beetle, which is not a bark beetle, I don't think.
No.
You know, here right next to the fungal mat, you have bark beetle activity. And so stands to reason that maybe that is another opportunity for that disease to hitch a ride.
Because I do believe that at one point, if that fungal mat is disturbed, not only does insects and birds can move it, can wind. You know, so if there's a beetle opening the vascular system of the tree, can the wind blow that spore over too? Next, please. So what happened is that there's a bunch of entities in Michigan that are working together. You know, very similar to the Oak Wilt plan that Texas has. Michigan has created the Michigan Oak Wilt Coalition last year. And members on the board is the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, Michigan State University Extension, product manufacturers, private sectors, and one of the biggest ones that we haven't talked about is utility companies are involved. It is a big problem in the Midwest and in Michigan where utility companies are, you know, obviously they're responsible for a grid doing pruning. And they were, until this year, they were doing pruning irregardless to what type of tree species to clear the energy. So there's a few pending lawsuits in Michigan where the utility company come in, did energy clearance, pruned oak trees during the flight time, and all the trees are dead in this whole corridor. So there is a lot more education that needs to be on all entities that handle trees. So it's good to see the utilities involved with the Oak Wilt Coalition. A lot of your samples, and this is Michigan State Diagnostic Lab, who's handling all the Oak Wilt. And through the coalition, if you're in Michigan, the Oak Wilt samples can be sent in at no charge. So if you have any, and anybody's from Michigan and they're interested, you can contact me afterwards and I'll get you in contact for the right people. So this is our lab. So if anybody has any questions or they want to know where to go or who to call, those are the contact information. Next, please. So what are we doing? Education. On the right side there is our very own Dr. Don Grossman. Dr. Don has been with the Texas Forest Service for quite a few years. I think it's 20 years, Emmett?
17, I believe. He was with TFS.
Yeah, so now we have him in our lab. He brought all his experience and research with us. So we get to pull on him to come out and do Oak Wilt seminars. And we probably do in Michigan anywhere from 6 to 12 throughout the winter into spring just to educate. So big education on the Oak Wilt is huge for us. Next slide. Do you go 2 clicks or 1?
Just 1.
Oh, Emmett brought up a great point earlier. He showed you the big saw that they're using in Texas for separating root grafting. It's a little different in Michigan. A lot of the areas where the red oaks grow is a very sandy soil. So we have to, in Michigan, the required depth for root graft separation is 5 feet in depth. So we have a couple of manufacturers up here. This is kind of one of the vibratory plows that Vermeer designed. That's a 4.5 foot for display or a demonstration, but we have to get 5 foot in depth. And another thing that we didn't talk about is that can you do a root separation or not? In the forest, Michigan DNR does a great job because they're in the forest and you're not worried about utilities, underground utilities, property lines. In an urban setting, one of the problems is there's a lot of places where you can't do root separations, and you have to rely on chemical treatments in hope that did not root graft. So root grafting, like I said, all these are all part of an Oak Wilt plan. Next.
I'm going to hijack your slide, Joe.
Yeah.
So the deeper the soils are, the greater potential for this disease. And so Joe was talking, and it reminded me of something I wanted to say. I grew up in a little town called Hondo, Texas. It's west of San Antonio, and there's a neighborhood there called Coleman Oaks, and Oak Wilt has ravaged that neighborhood. The oaks there were huge, and I say were because most of them are dead. I'm talking they were greater than 50 inches in diameter. That neighborhood was close to a couple of creeks, and so the soil there was very deep, which was excellent for this disease to move. When those trees are rooted deeper, the trenching it doesn't work. And so as you move north from Hondo into the hill country of Texas, which becomes a more rocky soil, shallower soil, the trenching does a very good job because you're able to trench and actually sever those root grafts effectively. But when you're in a deep soil like what Joe's talking about, and in certain parts of Texas, there's another city called Pleasanton, which is their city motto is live oaks and nice folks. It just happens to be the largest oak wilt disease center in Texas, over 800 acres infected with oak wilt. The soils are sandy and very deep, and so that disease can really travel through root grafting really well. And so just want to mention that to you. The other thing is that treating for oak wilt, in my experience, small trees respond better to the treatment than large trees. Back to you, Joe.
Yep. So here's some of our one of our education sites, Michigan Oak Wilt Coalition. We got some grant money from the state for more education, and we found some properties in northern Michigan that had either oak wilt on it or next to it to do a hands-on education class. So this was actually, not only were we really treating these trees with chemistry, we walked onto the property with the blinders on and made the classroom, after a sit-down indoor class, come out and rewrite what an oak wilt plan would be. And all these properties were different. So when we talk about an oak wilt plan, there may be, a removal may be the only thing possible. And on this site where you see the IVs, there's Dr. Don again modeling in his reindeer. We almost got rained out on that. Again, we don't have much of a drought up here, so even in August, we're torrential downpours. We had to evaluate. So there's 12 trees on this site. 3 were removals. We had to separate roots the best we could from surrounding cottages. There's a lake on the bottom, so it was a very intricate plan to try to eliminate the spread of oak wilt on this property. So every site's going to be different. Again, symptomatic trees. Emmett mentioned that even in Texas, if it's got any sign whatsoever, it's a removal. We're saying the same thing here in the Midwest. The rate of efficacy on symptomatic trees is very low. So it's a removal, it's treatment, it's root graft separation, and education. So there's a lot of things that have to be monitored to determine what you're going to do on each site. This is kind of an idea of where our territories are. We're going to talk, but Emmett showed a couple of slides. Just before he was ended on some of the research that's going on between macro and micro, and showing that micro and macro have about the same percentage of efficacy. And a lot of that studies is done on flat terrain. So the DNR brought up a great question to me. What about, in certain parts of Michigan, it's pretty mountainous, so it's kind of tough to lug the amount of water that you need. So there's a lot of ongoing research on the compounds that we use for oak wilt. Emmett showed macro versus micro. I'm working with the DNR now to show, can we do it neat without water at all? And it can be effective because you can't get water to some of these sites. And we're trying to figure out, can it be done in the spring or in the fall? So there's still a lot of ongoing research on oak wilt and oak wilt treatments that we're pretty excited about the opportunity to build on a plan.
That's a good point, Joe. And the other thing is that my second slide, propiconazole hit the market in 1990. That's almost 30 years ago. So how far has the fungicide industry come in 30 years? And trying out some of these new active ingredients is stuff that we're working on at Arborjet, and potentially developing a new fungicide that's even more effective against this disease. That's something that I've been excited about since I started working with Arborjet, because, you know, stuff is dated. So that's what I want to look at is more active ingredients.
Yeah. And like I said, same thing with, you cross back over to emerald ash borer, which I started out with. You know, when they started looking at that, there was probably 150 compounds being used to test for EAB. I think with the spread of fungal pathogen and bacteria throughout the landscape, I see a lot of research going into new compounds to treat those diseases in the landscape and in the forest. So it's pretty exciting stuff.
So guys, here's a look at...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. If you look where Oak Wilt is, we have 4 reps, 5 if count Cy. This starts at the tip of one of the states, but you can see there's 5 of us working in the field on this with all of our corresponding extension offices. So don't be afraid to lean on us for some information.
Perfect, Joe, because my next slide is help me help you. All right, Jerry McGuire. Guys, and that's truthfully what we are here for. When you boil down, Joe said earlier that we wear a lot of hats, but when you boil down what our job description is, it is to help our customers be successful. And so help us do that. Call me, call Joe, call wherever state you're in, call your rep. If you've got something that you need help with, we can't help you unless we know. And so here's my contact information. One thing I forgot to mention, the reason I'm on this call is I actually have another certification that's Texas Oak Wilt certified. The Texas Forest Service and ISA Texas put on a program a couple of times a year. They have a 2-day course about oak wilt. And so we just covered a ton of information in an hour. They put on a 2-day course. Part of it is an injection demonstration, and they cover all aspects of this disease. They have multiple experts talking about it. But, as Joe and I led off with, we've got a lot of experience in the tree industry. And so if you need help with something, that is our job. And we're happy to do it. So just want to finish off with that.
Emmett, I just wanted to let you know that because the Texas Oak Wilt Certified Program is so successful, Michigan chapter of ISA, Agricultural Society of Michigan, we're going to be launching the Michigan Oak Wilt certification. So thank you, Texas.
Great. Okay, guys, we got a question that popped up in the chat box here. It's from Karina. She says, is the root crown excavation necessary if we use Arborjet? The answer is no. With the Arborjet, you do not have to excavate the root collar. The idea behind that is to get as low down as possible. If you have a good root flare on the tree, I would always utilize that. That's the best place to inject trees. root collar excavation is beneficial to trees just because. So if your tree is buried under dirt, I would encourage that, but it is not necessary to inject the trees. Guys, that's the end of the presentation. Again, if you want an ISA CEU, if you're a certified arborist, please send me your CEU number, and I can get a post-presentation CEU sent to you. Karina sent another question. She's in Los Angeles. I do not think you have to worry about Oak Wilt in LA. You've got enough tree issues, but from what I know, Oak Wilt is not in California.